Okay, well, welcome everybody again. Looks like the number of participants are slowing down a bit. I'm sure we'll still have some folks coming in. But again, I'd like to welcome everybody to our sixth workshop related to the development of the 2022 Transportation Asset Management Plan for California. Today's workshop is pretty exciting because it's really where we bring all the pieces that we've been talking about to date together. And we do that in the form of an investment strategy within the Transportation Asset Management Plan. And so today's workshop will kind of split in half. The first half of the workshop will provide background and training on the investment strategies with some examples. We have a consultant, Brad Allen with Applied Pavement Technologies, that will be joining us to help us with that. Applied Pavement Technology has been conducting National Highway Institute training on investment strategies nationwide, and I think they'll add a lot of value to our discussion today. And then once we get through the background, get everybody up to speed on what the investment strategies are all about, then we'll transition into a tool that Caltrans has built for use in developing the 2022 TAMP investment strategy. So that's kind of our plan. We've got about 2 hours to kind of walk through all of this. And maybe with that, if we could queue up the PowerPoint, that would be great. Okay, for those of you that are on the line, we're going to do a couple of polls like we've done in our previous workshop. So if you could get your cell phone handy, that would be helpful. Okay, so this is investment strategy and target setting workshop. My name is Mike Johnson. I'm the Caltrans State Asset Management Engineer. We've got a number of speakers today, and we'll introduce them as we get to their particular section of the overall presentation. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we show this slide at every workshop just to keep everybody apprised of where we are sort of on our march along. This is showing workshop 4. We ended up doing 2 for risk, and then we did one that was what we call the kickoff. It wasn't really numbered, but this is effectively our 6th workshop that we've done, or at least 6th session. And after this, we have really the improvements, and then we'll draft the TAMP. So this is our second to last workshop. Next slide. Timeline, we started this back in April, and we're kind of working through. The big date that we're working towards is March 2022. That's the date our draft TAMP, or really our draft final TAMP, needs to go to the California Transportation Commission, as well as the Federal Highway Administration California Division Office. Next slide. So here's the I talked just generally about it, but like I said, up say the first hour plus, we'll be talking about understanding these investment strategies. What are the requirements? How do we do this? And then we'll transition into this tool that was developed to help everybody do this. And then we'll close. Hopefully do closing remarks around 2:50. As with prior workshops, the formal workshop will end at 3. The panelists will stick around for a bit. If there's any questions that you didn't get to ask during the workshop or didn't want to ask in front of 100 people, you're certainly welcome to stay on the web conference, and it usually drops down to a much more intimate setting at 3 o'clock. So next slide. Okay, so hopefully if you can hear me, that means you joined properly. If you cannot hear me, then just please pay attention to this join now. You might want to exit the web conference and come back in. We will use chat quite a bit. Please make sure you're chatting to everyone. Okay, if you say all attendees, then nobody that's on the panel or no organizer will get it. So please, if you're going to chat, you want to make a comment or you want to get the attention of anybody that's involved in the workshop, please make sure you're chatting to everybody. Likewise, you can use the raise hand feature if you want to get anybody's attention. And if you're having any technical assistance needs during the workshop, please feel free to email ct-tam@dot.ca.gov. We have people monitoring that email address, and they'll be able to call you offline and kind of work out whatever's going on. Next slide. Okay, we're going to use polling again. So if you have a cell phone available and you can send a text message, and the number you'll text is 22333. And in the body of the text, type in Caltrans 300. Once you do that, you'll get a reply back. Don't click on that link, please. But once you get the reply back, you're ready to participate in the survey. So we're going to do a couple of quick surveys just so we know who all is on the line. Next slide. Okay, so again, if you didn't catch it, text 22333. Type in Caltrans 300, and then the first question is which, oh, sorry, can we go back one? Okay, so which agency or organization do you represent? This is a way for us to see who's doing the polls and who's not doing the polls, and also who's there. So it's good to see those MPO numbers creeping up a bit. Since a lot of this workshop is really germane to the MPOs. Okay, we got over 100 people in the workshop today, so I'll give a couple more minutes for folks to get their polling done. Again, if you want to participate in the polls, text Caltrans 300 to 22333, and that will get you in the polling. Okay, so it's like some MPOs, some regional transportation planning agencies, some cities, few counties. We've got some others. Good to see the MPOs getting up over half. I like that. And then we've got some Caltrans folks as well in the house. Okay, next slide. Okay, the second poll is really asking what area within your organization are you working primarily? And if a lot of times people are using F for asset management. So if you're in a specific asset management function, please use F. Okay, so similar to our previous workshops, we get a pretty good cross-section of functional areas within the organizations that are represented. So that will help us have a real good, robust discussion. And it's nice to see we're getting almost 50% of you responding. If you're in programming, you'd probably fall into maybe a budgets or finance. I'd put you in B. Okay, appreciate that. So we kind of have an idea who's here and what perspective everyone's coming from. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to run through some of the requirements, if you will. At the bottom of this slide, or here in the white, you see this 23 CFR 515.5. That's the Code of Federal Regulations. If anyone wants more information, we try to include those reg references. If you're, if you're really a glutton for punishment, want to go read the regs. But we've extracted the most relevant information for you. So, one of the first things that you might all be asking is, well, what are these transportation asset management investment strategies? And I think, the top bullet really kind of covers it. It's these strategies that you are going to put in place. They're, in effect, policies for how your resources are going to be allocated to deliver the best asset performance, given the funding that you have available, the goals that you've have set, and the objectives of the, Caltrans and or local agencies here. The one thing I would add to this is that in that top bullet is that we need to also be keeping an eye on our risks. Okay, so we did a risk workshop that fits in there too. So this workshop is really about the intersection of inventory and condition, available funding, risk. Those three things in the form of, what are we going to do for life cycle planning? What's our risk tolerance? These things are really what this workshop's all about. So we're going to look at various funding scenarios. There's a couple that are required in federal regulations, so we're not going to talk too much about them today. One of those requirements is to figure out how much money it would take to achieve the desired state of repair for the entire national highway system, meaning jointly owned by Caltrans and by cities and counties and represented by MPOs and RTPAs. Also, what do we think we'll be able to do with the funding that we have? And then there's this strategy in the middle, which is really what the bulk of this workshop is going to talk about. And that is the investment strategy that we plan to follow as transportation agencies within California. Next slide. So what are these? Or what do we have to do? I mean, we have to discuss how our asset management plan investment strategies would collectively support or make progress towards the goals that we set in transportation performance management. That's achieving and sustaining the desired state of good repair over the life of the asset. And the over the life of the asset is kind of a nod to we want to be looking across the entire lifespan of our assets and even a portfolio of assets in the form of life cycle planning. And Brad's going to talk quite a bit about that in a few minutes. We want to improve or preserve the condition of the assets for pavements and bridges at a minimum. And we want to show that the investments that we're proposing are adequate to achieve the targets that were set forward. And there's the 23 USC 150. Those are the transportation performance management regulations that we talked about in our kickoff workshop with the with the panel of experts from Federal Highways. And again, achieving the national goal. So the same reference, same segment. Next slide. So the federal requirements, because just a reminder, man, we have both federal and state requirements that we have to meet in California. And that makes it a little trickier than, maybe some agencies that only have one, because we've got to really thread the needle between what's required under California state law and also what's required under federal regulation. But under the federal requirements, this investment strategy is a process to describe how our investments are influenced by performance gap analysis. So that's condition, inventory condition, and targets, right? That's what leads to the performance gap analysis, life cycle planning, risk management analysis, and then what funding do we think we have available, and what is it going to cost to do that work in the future? So you really take these things and you're trying to develop a strategy that is considering all of these for you to go forward and execute in the coming 10 years. Next slide. At the state level, there are requirements that are put into place in government code and streets and highway code. And, they're a little bit more vague in that they say that we'll develop a robust asset management plan that meets the federal TAMP requirements and also includes assets on the state highway system. The state law gives the California Transportation Commission the authority to really set the direction for what happens in the California TAMP. And so it's important, and we do work with the commission to make sure that we can deliver a single transportation asset management plan that is meeting what the commission is requiring, as well as meeting all the federal requirements that we have to hit. So it's not a trivial thing to satisfy both in one document, but that's what we're endeavoring to do. We did that on the initial TAMP, and I don't see any reason why we can't continue that here. Next slide. So our initial TAMP, we had some investment strategies, and I mean, these are words. I think it'll become more obvious when we start getting into the specifics. But the kinds of things that we talk about that are strategies are things like, we want to fix it first. Okay, we don't want to expand the transportation system beyond what is sustainable for us to maintain. We want to leverage investments, utilizing grants and federal funds and all of the funding programs that are available, statewide competitive programs, STIP, SHOP, maintenance, local, on the local side, you've got sales tax revenue and bond revenue and other sources. So we want to leverage all of that to the best advantage of the system. We can focus on selected asset classes. That's typically done. There's sort of a point of diminishing return to get too small on these asset classes. Maybe we have a strategy about sustainable pavements or just sustainable transportation in general. And then, we might want to think about, what are we doing for other modes, bike, ped, transit, above and beyond what we're thinking about just in terms of, the people, the vehicles operating on our roadways. Next slide. For the 2022 TAMP, we're proposing something pretty different. Throughout this workshop, you'll see we are proposing to let each MPO develop their own investment strategy and communicate that to us. And then for the California TAMP, we will aggregate those MPOs along those MPO investment strategies along with the investment strategies of Caltrans to represent California in the TAMP. Next slide. So comparing, the initial plan to this plan, the two lower bullets on both of these columns have to be done. These are federal regulations. In our initial TAMP, we looked at a pre-SB1, post-SB1 funding scenarios because SB1 had just passed and, that seemed to be the thing to do. What we didn't do in the initial TAMP was really include any of the risks. So in the 2022 TAMP, we're planning to expand to incorporate risk, and we'll show you how we're going to do that. Next slide. When we did our initial TAMP, this was all pretty new. There was a lot going on in terms of just understanding all of these rules and what needed to happen. We've matured a lot, and so, we're proposing to really switch focus. In the 2018 TAMP, our initial TAMP, we did basically a top-down analysis. So we looked at the entire national highway system, irrespective of who owned it. we looked at what we thought it was going to take to, what we thought we had in terms of budget. We had statewide deterioration. We had, kind of one strategy, which was really all about fix it first. And, we came up with some analysis. For 2022, the product of our earlier workshops and some of the listening sessions that we had, it was pretty clear that every MPO area is going to want to have a different strategy potentially. Coastal area might want to be thinking about sea level rise where an interior area of California wouldn't. Maybe they want to be thinking about fires from a risk perspective. What they expect in terms of condition is variable from each MPO. We already know that. And what each MPO has in terms of resources, financial resources to affect the kinds of improvements that they want is also quite variable. So for this 2022 TAMP, we're proposing a bottom-up approach, which, to our knowledge has never been done in the country, and certainly not with this many MPOs. So we're optimistic that, we're going to be able to provide this level of flexibility for all the MPOs to set their own strategies and then communicate those to us. Next slide. Part of this, and it's hard to have this conversation without talking about performance targets, because a big part of, looking at the condition is looking at the performance gap between the inventory and condition you have currently and the inventory and condition you expect in the future. So, keeping it simple, if the inventory was unchanged, but we had a goal of better pavement or better bridges, that's going to take an investment, right? So how big of an investment it takes is really a function of how aggressively the targets are set. And so the tool that we're going to demonstrate in a bit will provide the MPOs a little sandbox to look at different things, look at how much money would take to hit certain targets, and kind of iteratively work your way into what you believe are appropriate targets for your agencies. Because overall, the TAMP target in California that we put forward is a inventory weighted average of all of us, right? So Caltrans has a big influence on it because we have a lot of inventory, but all of the MPOs also have influence on that overall number. So, hopefully we get the right balance, meaning the TAMP is not Caltrans' document, it's the state of California's document. And so we need to make sure that we're, appropriately reflecting both state and local priorities in the development of the TAMP. The TAMP is a 10-year analysis, okay? So you may go read the regulations, and the regulations say the MPO set a 4-year target. That's true. Okay, but for the purposes of doing a bottoms-up investment strategy, we've set up the worksheets that we're going to go through to allow the MPOs to look at a 10-year time horizon, and then we do a calculation just based on a linear, extrapolation from the 10-year of what we think your 4-year target would be. Next slide. And this shouldn't, this target setting shouldn't be a new topic. I mean, we last visited this in October of 2020. We went out to all the MPOs. There was an opportunity at what they call the mid-plan performance period to reevaluate the targets. I don't think any MPO changed their target in October 2020. But we will go through the same process of the development of this TAMP. We want you to pick targets that are, feasible for you to achieve, and ones hopefully that kind of push your agency a little bit, and then we'll just use a quantity weighted approach and roll those all up for the statewide TAMP. Next slide. Okay, so that kind of covers what we have to do. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Brad Allen with Applied Pavement Technology. And Brad's going to kind of run through, some of the basics of investment strategy development.
All right, well, hi, everybody. It's good to be with you this afternoon. My name's Brad Allen, as Mike said. Thanks, Mike, for inviting me. I'm with the company Applied Pavement Technology. We're a small consulting firm that has recently, I've been with them for 5 years. So I have been recently working with them to work with states on asset management plans and also work with federal highways on guidance development and developing some workshops. And most of what I'm going to go over today is from a federal highways workshop that was developed back in 2017 after the new regulations were released and delivered to 4 different national workshops in anticipation of right after the new TPM and asset management plan regulations were released as folks were developing their first targets and their first TAMPs. And then we also delivered this to almost half of the states, and Caltrans was the first state agency that we delivered the training to. Now, it's a one-day workshop, so you're going to get the abridged version today. I'm going to kind of hit the high points that will hopefully give you what you need to respond to what you're going to learn about in the second half of today's workshop. So what we hope to do today, as Mike said, this is really where everything comes together from what you've been learning in the prior workshops to say, how do we want to use our available funding to drive asset conditions through the 10-year period of our TAMP, but also with a look at how is this setting us up really for the long term. And where we look at 2- and 4-year targets in particular, they're fairly short term. And the 10-year TAMP gives us a bit longer time horizon. But some of the things I'll be talking about today actually, and some of the things you've been talking about in the prior workshops, really have implications that last longer than 10 years. And that's something that needs to be kept in mind. So we'll be talking about, as Mike mentioned, inventory, condition, targets, life cycle planning, which I'm assuming might be a new term to some folks. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about life cycle planning, risk management and our finances and how all of these contribute to the selection or development and communication of an asset management investment strategy. So, and really each of those items represents a different analysis that's undertaken as you're developing your TAMP, and it's the results of each of those analyses that build towards developing the investment strategies. So what's listed here are the 7 required components for an asset management plan. Go ahead and hit advance one more time there, Don, please. Yeah, and this is all part of this is actually in statute. This isn't part of the regulation that came out after. This was established through the MAP 21 legislation in Title 23, and this is part of the requirements for the National Highway Performance Program, which provides funding for the National Highway System. That fund source was developed through MAP 21, and part of the requirements for being eligible for that fund source is having a risk-based transportation asset management plan, and these are the components of that plan. And so you can see how this lines up with your workshops and what we'll be talking about today. So I just want to provide a little bit of a background on where all this came from and why it's so important. Next slide. So we have a series of questions. What I've done is tried to take the information from the requirements and break it down to a series of questions that I think make it a little bit easier to think through how all of these pieces connect to develop an asset management plan. So go ahead, Don, click thanks. So first is what conditions are your assets in? What do I own? I like to sum it up as, what do I own? Where is it? And how bad is it? That's kind of the questions you got to ask. How close are we to where we want to be with our assets? So that gets us to the next bullet, the next question. what are your targets and your long-term goals for asset conditions? In the current California TAMP, there's a 10-year condition target that's presented. One of the terms we'll be talking about as we get into this is the desired state of good repair. That's a term from the regulation, and it describes that long-term goal. You can set that as a 10-year time horizon target, or other states have chosen to define that as the steady state they would like to get their assets into. So if it's the level of condition that if they achieved, they'd stop trying to do better. There'd be diminishing returns beyond that. All right, the next question, how do asset conditions impact my system performance? So that's something, I think, going back to your first workshop, and we'll talk a little bit about this, there's a connection between asset conditions and system performance, and there's a connection between activities that you may do to enhance system performance that may improve asset conditions or may cause your assets to deteriorate more quickly, and you need to understand that relationship. Next question, thanks. So do you understand how different investments impact asset conditions? So now we're talking about work you do to pavements and bridges or other assets to maintain them or preserve them or replace them. Do you have a good understanding of if I invest so much in a given activity, what will that do for my asset conditions? And do you understand that impact in the short term, which is fairly straightforward? Do you understand that impact over the asset life cycle? To get an understanding of, a bridge that's designed to last 50, 80, 100 years, pavements that may be designed to last 20 to 50 years or more. Do we know how these treatments impact them? And that's what life cycle planning is about. Next question. So what risks are priorities for you, for your agency, and what can you do to address those risks, right? It's not just about what worries you, but what investments are you going to make to address those risks, and how will that impact either what you have to invest to address conditions, or maybe those investments directly address conditions. Thanks. And so next, how do you plan to balance the funding across all these priorities? And this is where it really comes together, where you think about how important is each of these questions, the answer to each of these questions, what's driving you, and how do you put this together to come up with a balanced investment portfolio? And the strategy that allows you to build towards that portfolio is your investment strategy. And then finally, what types of actions will be taken through those funding priorities? So now you know how you want to invest, what your priorities are. Now you need to document that in terms of how much of different types of work will you be delivering, and how much will you be funding that work in each of the different types. So that's the term work type is something we'll be talking about. So I think this is a build slide, Don. Please, you could click one more time. Yeah, so performance gap analysis. I know you've had a workshop on this. This really encompasses the first three of our questions. So what condition are your assets in? What targets or long-term goals do you have? And how does the system performance impact conditions? So the TAMP is just one of several statewide performance plans that are required under the Transportation Performance Management requirement. So the TAMP has its own requirements, and then TPM has another set of requirements, but they really all go together, and they're all these 10-year plans that are meant to connect your strategic plans or your long-range 20-year plans to your programming or your TIPS and STIP. The TAMP is primarily focused on asset conditions, but there are requirements to consider how the conditions of other performance areas impact those asset conditions. So the regulation defines a performance gap as the gap between the current asset condition and the state DOT targets for asset condition, and the gap between the gaps in performance effectiveness that are best addressed by improving the physical assets. So your asset management plan needs to take into account, are there congestion issues in my system or freight choke points that can be addressed by improving the physical infrastructure? Do I have safety concerns that can be improved or addressed by improving the physical infrastructure? And then there's also the flip side of that. Are there investments in these other plans that are going to lead to asset improvements that I might not otherwise be accounting for, that could lead me to be a little too conservative in my asset management strategy? So go ahead to the next slide, please. So if we dig into this a little bit, into these two parts, the condition-related performance, that's what's informed by current and future conditions, targets, and the desired state of good repair. And on the left side of this chart, we see an example from Montana DOT that they, in their TAMP, describe their current performance gaps for conditions and how they will be addressing that through their investments. So the state of good repair is shown as the two horizontal dashed lines. They are showing the percentages of good and poor, the desired condition for the interstate pavements, which are the blue line with the circles, and the non-interstate NHS, which is that orange line with the squares. And you can see that they're overperforming historically leading up to 2018 with the interstate system, but they have a performance gap for the non-interstate system. So this shows really that gap, as well as their expectations through their investment strategy to shift funding to bring the interstate pavement in line with their performance expectations and bring and address that gap in the non-NHS. So that's a good example of showing how the performance gap can influence your investment strategies, at least in this one case. For the so one key to this graph in meeting the state's long-term state of good repair objective. And what I want to point out there is that they're not trying to get there right away, right? So they can they're not very high above their mark with interstate pavement. So it's probably not a big adjustment, and they expect that to self-correct pretty quickly. But you can see they expect to take a few years on the non-interstate NHS to get to their desired state of good repair. The desired state of good repair is a long-term outlook thing. It's not something you have to achieve overnight or that you even really have to achieve. That may be a stretch goal, and you can set other objectives within the TAMP period to say, well, this is where we expect our assets to be, but ideally we'd be at this desired state of good repair. All right, let's move to the next slide. So from the performance gap, you get information on your targets. So if you can align the performance gap analysis with your target setting, that's ideal, because that really allows you to say, this is where we are, this is where we want to be, this is where we think we will be, and you can set your targets so that they're achievable. That's not always possible. But your targets typically are going to be your 2- and 4-year targets you're going to set, and possibly a 10-year target. They're all going to be typically time-bound and within the time period of the TAMP. And the official targets are based on the national measures that are established in the regulations. So your desired state of good repair, you'll get that out of this analysis too, or it's one piece that you'll need to establish. That's defined by each state, and there's no real rule beyond that. What we try to encourage folks to do is to set the desired state of good repair as the condition state that doesn't make economic sense to exceed. So if you think about what it would cost to keep your pavements or bridges perfect, it would be an astronomical sum, right? You'd be reconstructing things all the time. But there's also a real cost to having a lot of poor pavements and bridges. So what's the mix of conditions that allows you to deliver the services that you need to, but provides you with the lowest practical life cycle costs, if you want to think of it that way. What are the lowest long-term costs to give you the best manageable conditions? And that's your desired state of good repair. You'll also get from this an idea of what investments does it take to achieve those targets and desired state of good repair. But there's a few other things that you want to keep in mind before you just settle in to say, oh, we could close this gap by investing this much funding in the short term. The next slide. And that's what brings us to life cycle planning. So life cycle planning is a little different than a lot of the other aspects of the TAMP because it's the one piece of analysis that really even looks beyond the time of the asset management plan. Once you have a handle on your asset management goals and how close or far you are from obtaining them, it's really important to understand how these different types of investments can influence your asset conditions, not just to get to your goals within the TAMP time period, but what does that mean for your asset conditions in the future? So through life cycle planning, you use this to evaluate different strategies, and you see that at the bottom of the diagram, and approaches to managing your assets. And this is done typically through computerized pavement and bridge management systems, or for some other assets, spreadsheets. But you can start this with spreadsheet tools, and many states did use spreadsheet tools back in 2018 and 2019, and they're moving towards having more robust tools statewide. But it's to get yourself started in life cycle planning. It really doesn't take a whole lot to get started, and then you just look to improve over time. Next slide. One note I want to make here is the difference between life cycle planning and life cycle cost analysis that many of you may be familiar with from project level work. You might do a life cycle cost analysis to different design alternatives for a project to determine your preferred alternative. And life cycle planning uses some of those same techniques, but it's a network level approach. So instead of talking about one section of pavement or one bridge or one area where you have lots of project level detailed information and you've already done, significant engineering investigations to really understand the situation, and you've already done public outreach and all of that, life cycle planning is done at your network level. Before the planning stage, before the project planning stage, it's network level planning. So let's go to the next slide. So your inputs for life cycle planning are going to be much simpler than your inputs for life cycle cost analysis at a project level. But the analysis itself is still complicated because now, in the case of a state like California, you're dealing with thousands of bridges and tens of thousands of miles of pavement, right? So that's what complicates this and means you can't really dig in and do in-depth detailed analysis on every single segment of pavement. You have to trust surface distress data and data that can be collected rapidly, things like that. So the inputs to the life cycle planning include the current conditions, the annual funding and budgets, your analysis time frame, which we'll talk a little bit about that, performance curves, how do we expect our assets to behave in the future, what treatments do we have available, what are the costs of those treatments, and then what's our strategy for applying those treatments and using those costs to improve the assets over time. So yeah, next slide. Actually, I'm sorry, go back to that slide. I want to make this one more point. I'm sorry. So one thing I want to point out in the graphic on the right that just demonstrates this idea that an asset moves through its life cycle, and over time, assets will deteriorate under exposure and traffic loading, but work can be performed on those assets, right, to improve the conditions. So at different points in an asset's life, there are different types of work that you can deliver to address the needs of the asset at that time, right? So if an asset's in relatively good condition before distress has started, or maybe just as distress is initially being seen, there might be some preventive measures that you can perform to stop that distress from continuing. Once distress or delay it for a period of time. Once there's a certain level of distress, right, you have to do a little bit more repair, or you may have to do a lot of repairs that leads to a rehabilitation. So the labels in each of those boxes, the green and blue circles, are different work types that are defined within the asset management regulation. And these are the different work types that need to be included in the asset management plan. So that's initial construction, maintenance, preservation, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Disposal does not need to be included. It isn't included in the regulation because there isn't considered a cost with that, although there likely is. But the other 5 need to be included in the asset management plan. And then, but each state, again, kind of defines which types of treatments belong in each of these work types. But it's really the understanding that the different work, there are certain times in an asset's life that a given work type is appropriate, and there's times when that work type is either too much, it's too heavy, it's unnecessary, or maybe it's too light, something that might be called a Band-Aid treatment. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through, about the right timing of those treatments and the costs of those treatments and how you analyze that over the long term. Okay, thanks. Next slide. All right, so current conditions, we won't belabor this. It is, what are your current assets, the inventory of those assets, and what condition are they currently in? That's your baseline. Typically, that's called in a life cycle planning analysis. Where are you starting from? You have that information from Caltrans. Here's a clip from the TAMP. And I think this was presented to you in an earlier workshop where they laid out what are your pavement and bridge assets in each MPO area, and what condition are they currently in. Next slide. All right, so the next question is, for the analysis, you have to assume some level of budget. And so this is an example out of the FHWA guidance that shows what you might do to assume different funding levels in a life cycle planning analysis. Again, this tends to be very high level. You don't break it down by funding group or anything like that. Just how much funding do we think we might have available to manage our assets? Because the amount of funding going in will drive some of the decisions you make about those assets in the analysis, right? If you a little bit more funding, you may spend it on some more expensive treatments, things like that. So you could look at, your historic funding level. You can look at the one down there, the lowest level of investment for the next 10 years. That would be what you think would be the lowest possible. Maybe if all your funding risks came true, how much funding do you think you'd have available? And then you can look at some that might be developed iteratively, like how much funding does it take to maintain your conditions, or how much funding does it take to meet your desired state of good repair. This is one way to take a look at that, and then we'll talk through the other pieces of this where you can actually then, through continuing the analysis, get in and say, wow, maybe if I invest that same amount of money a different way, I can get a different outcome. But starting with some assumption about funding is really important. Next slide. All right, so the next piece is the analysis time frame. And I apologize, some of this is the print's a little bit small, but I thought this slide did a really good job of describing this. And the idea is that asset life cycles are really long, right? So if you've got something like a bridge, and you're expecting your deck to last 20 years, your substructure to last 50, maybe you've got a design life of something now in the around 75, 80, 100 years. So when we're talking about a 10-year asset management plan, if we just evaluate what's the best thing to do for these assets over 10 years, that's not really a life cycle plan for the asset, right? This is analysis you want to run out as long as you can to get a sense of what, over the life of a pavement or a bridge, what's the best order or sequence of treatments that I can provide. And so even though we're not starting with all new assets when we do this analysis, it's important to run that time frame out so you get a sense of what it takes to manage these assets over the long term. And as you look at longer term analyses, it will give you insights and we'll say, oh, maybe it is better to do this earlier treatment, or in some cases, maybe you can delay a little bit and provide a treatment, and that will buy you years in the future. It's something that you have to run through the models and see how it works out. But we do encourage folks to run these at least 20 years, sometimes 30 years, and with some models for bridges and even within spreadsheets, it doesn't require a bridge management system. They can run these life cycle plans out 100 years or more, and some states did for their asset management plans. Next slide. So all of this is based on, I talk about running through the models and seeing how investments affect assets over time. It gets down to this idea of a performance curve or a performance model. That is, when an asset is new, it's in perfect condition, and if left with no work over time, it will deteriorate, right? At what rate does it deteriorate depends on the distress you're measuring or the combinations of distresses that you're measuring, the loading of that asset, what type of environment it is in. So state DOTs, typically for pavements and bridges, will have lots of performance curves or assets of different types that are located in different locations and under different loading. This is an example from New Jersey, a DOT that shows different types of pavement under different types of loading and how quickly they decline. So you can see pavements failing anywhere from 20 to about 40 years, depending on those differences. However, again, using simple spreadsheet tools, agencies can get started with this with some basic assumptions on performance that can be established just through expert opinion and consensus. That can be your starting point, and then the curves can be those can be improved over time, and eventually with some data collection and history, you can develop your own custom curves for the performance. Next slide. All right, and then this is where, under treatments and treatment costs, this is where you get into the idea that different treatments are appropriate at different points in an asset's life, and those treatments come along with certain unit costs. And so that means that there's an ideal time to deliver that treatment. If you deliver it too late, that treatment isn't going to be effective. But if you wait for it to be too late for that one treatment, the next treatment is likely much more expensive. And this is a clip from the New York State TAMP. I thought it does a good job of describing this, what they call windows of opportunity for each treatment. And so you can see for every pavement that they put down, they expect to do nothing for a couple of years, and then they come in and do non-paving PM, which is crack seal. It could be route and seal, it could be a crack seal, but it's some form of crack treatment. And then they do some type of preventive maintenance overlay where they can. And the reason is because it's about 25% of the cost of doing a hot mix overlay in New York State. And then there's a window of opportunity where some type of overlay is needed, and if the pavement deteriorates any further beyond that, then some level of major rehabilitation or reconstruction is needed. And you can see the cost quadruples after each of those windows. All right. And we're going to come back to that as another example towards the end. So next slide. All right. So when you put all this together, it starts to give you an idea of how do you determine when is the right time to deliver these treatments, and how do you decide that if we don't have the funding to do every treatment that's appropriate, how do we pick the ones that will be done? Because typically what you're going to have is, for a given year, more needs than there is funding to address them. But you'll also have needs that if you delay it for a year, it's still in the same window of opportunity, right? So ideally, you would have enough funding and treatments identified for each life cycle stage that you can address each pavement within its current window of opportunity and keep it from deteriorating further. And if one has deteriorated, you'd just be able to catch that one up and send it back to closer to the beginning of its life cycle. That's not always possible, and this is where it gets really complicated. But each agency has to develop these strategy details and rules. Typically, in a pavement or bridge management system, you can think these are represented as a decision tree, or a series of if-then statements that says if the condition is, of a certain level, if it is this type of highway, if it is this type of pavement, then you can deliver a certain treatment. If it's a different type of pavement, even if it's in the same condition and the same location, maybe you would deliver a different type of treatment. So there's all these rules that allow you to understand your inventory, the condition it's in, and what it's appropriate, what's the appropriate treatment for that asset at that time. So these strategy detail rules are kind of baked in to the analysis software. Typically, again, a pavement or bridge management system, but these can also be developed using really inexpensive tools or spreadsheets, and there's some fairly inexpensive options as well. Next slide. All right, so I want to again come back to this concept of treatments versus work types. So this is, I thought, a good example from the Kentucky Asset Management Plan, where they show the 5 work types, and then what's in the next column is their typical treatment. So this is the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. And so they show that the maintenance treatments that they do for pavement are sweeping, crack sealing, pothole patching, and shoulder work. And then they have a whole bunch of preservation treatments that run from something as minor as a chip seal or slurry, which is like a half-inch, as thin as a half-inch, maybe even 3/8 overlay, to what they call a thin overlay, I believe was less than 2 inches of hot mix asphalt. So they call all of that preservation. And you can see that there's a wide variety of costs for each of those treatments. So in their system, they're trying to address as many pavements as they can with those thin treatments, chip seal, microsurfacing, cape seal, thin overlay, before those pavements need something more substantial. There's similar approaches to this for bridges. I'm focusing on pavements a bit through this because in this regard, they're a little bit simpler. Pavements just have one element, where bridges have superstructure, substructure, and decks, and then each of those components have multiple elements. It gets a little bit more complicated, but it's the same basic principles. So essentially for Kentucky, if they can preserve a mile of road for $34,000 with a microsurfacing, clearly you'd want to do that as much as you can. You can preserve like 8 miles of road with microsurfacing for the cost of one thin overlay. And certainly if you let it slide to a rehabilitation, now your costs are like 10 times the cost of that microsurfacing. So it's 10 miles you can preserve versus 1 mile of rehabilitation. So this kind of shows how you'd see the analysis kind of turn out the importance of this early work when that isn't always what people just looking at the pavement says, what's the need of the pavement? Like, oh, you need to fix this segment over here. As you look at it at a network level and what's best for the long-term performance of the pavement, you start to find out that, doing some of this early work, or as much of this early work as we can over the long term, is going to help get your system to good condition and keep it there longer. And that's really embodied in the Caltrans Fix It First philosophy. This is just providing a little bit of detail to it. So what does this look like in terms of an actual strategy? So we've got a couple examples from Ohio. And basically with bridges in Ohio prior to their 2018 TAMP, they really just built bridges and replaced them. So you'd see, they just planned to build a bridge. They did very minimal maintenance to it, really just operation stuff. And then at 50 years, they replaced it. And so what they did using life cycle planning, they identified interim maintenance preservation treatments that they could do every approximately 20 years. And they feel with that, they're stretching the lives of the same bridge. They're not changing their design standards. They're stretching the lives of the same bridge out as far as 75 years. But you can see where it takes a long analysis period to work this out, right? If you just do a 10-year analysis, you're not going to see the benefit of that preservation treatment. But doing these long-term analyses of how do bridges behave over their life cycle and what can we do at interim steps, it allows you to see that this is an improved strategy. Next slide, we have an example from Ohio on pavements. And here in pavements, again, they had a simple strategy. Every 10 years, they overlaid their low-volume pavements. Through some analysis, they determined, similar to Kentucky, they could apply some type of thin overlay. And I'm not pitching for liquid asphalt products here. You can see in there's also a thin overlay. And there are treatments you can do with rigid pavements too, but they're on a different life cycle. But the idea is that doing some timely preservation, they can stretch out that time, the period between overlays. And what this allowed them to do, actually, they freed up about $75 million a year from their paving budget by doing this. So I believe for them, it meant they didn't have to increase the paving budget. It showed they could use the funding they had. But in any case, it was a $75 million savings per year by changing their pavement strategy. So, all right, next slide. So from the life cycle planning, you're going to develop the treatments that you have available that work for you and the right timing for those treatments to lead to maximized asset service life. You're going to understand the current needs of your pavements, as well as what does it take to manage those conditions over time so that I can achieve my desired state of good repair and so that I can sustain it, not just so I can get to it, maybe by you can get to your desired state of good repair by applying a whole lot of thin pavement treatments over your bad pavements, right? Or going out and doing a whole bunch of quick repairs on bridges. Maybe you can bring bridges just from one side of deficient to non-deficient. But that's not over the long term going to provide you sustained progress. So that's what life cycle planning is about. How do I, over the long term, care for my assets? All right, next slide. All right, so that's life cycle planning, and that's by far the topic I'm going to get into the deepest. You spent a lot of time talking about risk. This is just another representation of the risk management process from ISO that everybody should be pretty familiar with by now. And it's really important to understand the risks to the conditions of your assets, because your life cycle plan can go out the window, right, if it doesn't address the need to have resilient assets that can withstand their environment. And sometimes things change and you realize your prior designs weren't as resilient as you'd hoped they were. And so you need to address that, and that may impact your investment strategies. So next slide. So the seismic retrofits of the 80s and largely of the 80s and 90s is a good example of using risk to really drive your investment priorities. And it changed investment decisions about which bridges were rehabilitated, which bridges were replaced, because seismic risk was factored in. So it wasn't just a change in engineering standards, it was a change in the priorities and the decisions that were being made. But now we're getting a broader view of risk, and these are some of the risks that were identified in the risk workshop. I forget which workshop number that was from a couple months ago, but in any case, things like sea level rise and coastal flooding, extreme weather that can lead to inland flooding, wildfires, which is certainly a major concern right now and moving forward in California. Are there resource constraints or uncertainties related to staff, funding? Are there changes in regulations? Or we're hoping that there's a new highway bill, right? But until there's certainly uncertainty about funding that's linked to legislation. And then any changes in system use, and certainly we've seen that over the last year, and folks are really struggling to know how to move forward. So, but the idea is to look at these risks and understand what can be done to address the risks. One part of that is what's the level of funding you want to invest in addressing these risks, and then that funding is not going to go towards your life cycle strategy, right? It's going to deviate from your life cycle strategy. But another piece is, are there things that you're doing to address these risks that then are going to influence the assets that you have to manage, or in other ways influence those asset life cycles? Are you installing different types of culverts? Are you installing different types of sign structures? Are you changing the design of your bridges so that they can be more resilient, less likely to scour, things like that? All that also feeds back into the life cycle planning and how you want to manage your assets. And it may also drive your unit costs. In that now when you do maintenance on something or when you do preservation on something, maybe you're also addressing other needs, and that can drive up the cost of treatments. So that's something else to consider. Next slide. So here's an example from New York State. I should mention I'm right now I'm in Albany, New York. Before joining AppTech 5 years ago, I was with New York State DOT for 20 years. And I was not part of the team that developed the TAMP that includes this program, though. So this was their Critical Bridges Over Water program, and I just thought it was a really good example of how a critical risk turned into a programming decision. So the agency realized they had major scour concerns. They identified 106 bridges that needed to be hardened or replaced with a more hardened structure to prevent against scour. And they made a pitch, if you will, to the federal government for additional funding, and they were able to secure funding from FEMA and HUD, of all places, making the argument that allowing them to address these needs now would be more cost effective than waiting for even a partial number of these to fail during extreme weather. And I believe some portion of this has led to some competitive funds that have been out under different programs. But in this is, if you were to look at bridge conditions and life cycle strategy and say which bridges needed to be replaced, you likely weren't going to, you're not going to come up with these 106, right? These 106 were really specifically because of this major scour risk that the agency had, and they turned that into what totaled out at about a $518 million program to replace 100 bridges. So very significant. This isn't on a, this is on a scale that is quite different than what you see in most asset management plans, but the same approach of, wow, once we start to look at risk, we can see the network-wide ramifications. Let's figure out how we can address this in a comprehensive investment strategy. Maybe that leads us to new funding. Maybe it just leads us to prioritizing the funding we have in a different way. All right, next slide. So the key with risks and how risk analysis feeds your investment strategy is that it's going to tell you how you want to address those risks and what the investment priorities or investment levels are with that. And that's where these 5 T's come in: treat, transfer, terminate, tolerate, or take advantage of. And there's cost implications with each of these. Treatment is something you're doing to mitigate the risk. What's the cost of that treatment? If you're transferring the risk, maybe, that's from one agency, typically transferring ownership of an asset to another agency. That's how that happens in asset management. It doesn't happen very often, but then maybe there's future obligations you don't have to worry about. Or maybe there's an initial cost to get that asset to a given condition so that the other agency will accept it. And again, with terminating a risk, maybe closing a facility, are there costs related to that? Are there potential cost savings related to that? Tolerate, that's just saying we're going to accept this risk and we'll see what happens. But maybe you need some type of funding set aside in case that risk actually comes into fruition. And then taking advantage of, that has to do with opportunities. So the things you can do now, are there expenditures you want to make now to set yourself up to take advantage of a potential opportunity or a positive uncertainty. Those are the types of costs for each of those activities that need to be factored into your investment strategy. Next slide. So the next piece is what funding is available to you, right? How much funding do you have? And there's 2 key pieces to availability. There's the total amount of funding or revenue that you have coming into your agency. And this is just a clip of some hypothetical funding from FHWA guidance that's available on the FHWA Asset Management website. But not all of this revenue that's coming in, right, is going to go just to drive asset conditions. You need to make sure you understand that some of this revenue is going to go to address safety. It's going to go to address congestion. It's going to go to operations. It's going to go to debt service. It's going to go to all sorts of different things. So that available funding, it's important to capture not just all of the funding coming in, but what's truly available to drive pavement and bridge conditions. And so some of that's going to get siphoned off into these risks and other things that may not be done directly to impact conditions, may not impact conditions at all. So it's important to get down to what is truly available to affect my asset management investment strategies. All right. So now we come to the point in the presentation where I tell you in 3 easy steps how to develop an investment strategy. So go ahead and click there, Don. Unfortunately, no such easy button exists. It really is, at this point, a process of trial and error. I think you can go through and click a few more times down to risk analysis results. Sorry, thanks. It's a build slide. There is no easy button for developing an investment strategy. One thing I meant to mention earlier is that we present this through every training as kind of a linear progression from what assets do you own to what funding do you have available, and what's your life cycle strategy, what are your risks, what conditions do you want to achieve. It's not a linear process. Each one of these analyses provides more information to the others. Each time you update your strategic highway safety plan, or if you have a CMAQ plan, right, that's going to provide information that's may influence your asset management investment strategy. So each time you update the TAMP, you need to look at what's happening in those other areas and incorporate it into your asset management strategy. It's all about balancing. There's lots of reports and research out there on things like multiple objective decision analysis. And there are some really great tools out there to help you with this. But whether these decisions are made by a group of stakeholders sitting around a table and discussing it with the facts and data that they have available, or whether you build a large algorithm to come up with a unit function that says this is how much benefit comes from each project, and you look to maximize benefit, it's still a process of saying what's important to us and how do we balance all of these different priorities to do as much of the most important work as we can. while taking care of everything that we need to take care of. All right, so another example, there's more New York examples in here than I think I originally realized now that I'm going through it, but a really simple visual. And I brought this one in, not because it's the greatest example, but honestly because it's a really simple example. You'll notice they don't have all 5 work types because in their last TAMP, they really didn't have a good idea of what their initial construction and preservation investments were, particularly for bridges. But you can see that they do have a sense of when they're spending this funding, how many bridges they're reconstructing, rehabilitating, and maintaining with their funding. And that not only tells you how much they're spending in those categories, but they can tell you the number of bridges or the square deck area that's being addressed. And in this case, it's the number of bridges, and you can kind of see that it's fairly well balanced. They're reconstructing about as many bridges as they're preserving or rehabilitating in a given year. And this is the balance they strive to achieve, and they describe that in their investment strategy. And then the investments that they then list in the TAMP show how that bears out. And 2018 and 2019 were the last years of the critical bridges over water investment. That's why they're so much bigger. The steady state really happened from 2020 on. All right, next slide. All right, so investment strategies should collectively help you make progress or support you towards achieving and sustaining your desired state of good repair over the life cycle of the asset. That's life cycle planning, right? It's not just getting there, it's getting there and staying there for as long as you can. You want to look to improve and preserve the condition of the assets and the system performance related to the condition of those physical assets. So you don't just want to get the assets to the condition that you want. You need to understand that condition is related to performance, and so that may lead you to prioritize different parts of the system over others, or have different desired condition states in different parts of the system because you have different performance expectations. It's also going to help you understand how to achieve your targets for TPM, those 2- and 4-year targets. Hopefully this is all connected. So the targets are set based on what you think you will achieve, and the investment strategy shows you the path forward to actually get there. So the national goals, that's related to the other areas of performance, right? Hopefully the conditions you're achieving through these investment strategies support safety, support economic development, support congestion mitigation, right? And last bullet. Finally, make sure that you're addressing the risks, which are threats and opportunities. It's really important, one last note on risk, to make sure that you're identifying some opportunities that you can set yourself up to capitalize on. That's how agencies really advance, is being ready when there's an opportunity to advance in a given area. Maybe that's technology, maybe it's funding, maybe it's skills training, but it's important to identify those and set yourself up for success. All right, okay, I have one more content slide, which is just to say, and this is almost a segue to the next part, your strategies are the description of what's important to you and how you're going to use your available funding and your available treatments to take care of your assets. Describing that as the strategy. From that strategy, you will develop this plan that says, in order to carry out this strategy, I need to invest different amounts of funding across these 5 work types in each year of the asset management plan. So the investments that are needed to implement the strategy aren't the strategy themselves. That's what it will take to deliver the strategy. But this is a really important piece that's also required to be in the asset management plan. And this is where what's going to be talked about in the next segment really comes into play, where you'll get this information and some tools to help you put together what's your strategy, and then what investments does that lead you to over the next 10 years. All right. And then I think my next slide is just a question slide, but I think we're pretty much right on time. So we can.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. Very, very good presentation. I'm sure everyone's heads are really spinning now with possibilities. I'm going to have everyone hold questions just so that we can move into this tool, because I think the tool that we've put together will really help make sense out of all of this. So I'm going to turn it over to Don Foster and Yue Joe to set up and then demonstrate the tool. So Don, I'll start with you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And thank you to Brad as well. I always learn a lot by listening in on our, I consider our national experts in this area. And I think that it's really, not only satisfying to recognize that we have really done a lot of work in California to support and ensure that we're meeting the federal requirements for this and the state requirements. And before we start, we're going to, do a lot of this is really heavy hitting on the local NHS. So, if you're a state asset management person who's listening in on this conference or workshop today, I just want to ensure you that, the information we're presenting is still relevant to all of you. But we've done a lot of this work already as part of our state highway system management plan. We have all of this information. It will be a lot. It's really good that we do have it so that we can take the portion of the NHS that's state-owned and then aggregate it with our local information to develop our TAMP. And so, again, thanks to Brad for really focusing in on this life cycle planning component. If you have not looked at our initial TAMP with regards to what we provided in there with regards to life cycle planning, I encourage you to take a look at that. And then even the rest of the chapters that are all pulling this together for us to develop the update to our next TAMP. So with that, I just want to go ahead and start this next section before Yue comes in and wows us with our new updated tool that we can all use, is to again summarize and talk about these, we consider these basic building blocks to do performance gap analysis, because that's what we really need to do. And for those that have not been involved in this process, or to recall what we talked about in our fundamentals workshop back in April, we want to bring these up again to make sure that, that we all kind of understand that data and the information that we need that provides us the ability to do this analysis. And these are the big pieces of the puzzle that we need to have in order to do this. So, baseline inventory and condition. Brad talked a lot about the available funding specific to pavement and bridges and by these federal work types. He talked briefly about the unit cost to improve condition and what kinds of work, what are the 5 work types that are going to help us to improve our fair assets and our poor assets to good condition, because that's what we want to state is we want these assets to be able to make progress and actually set targets that are reasonable and be able to, in the TAMP, demonstrate that we either are going to be achieving these targets, we're going to, make progress towards these targets. We need to have the ability to do this analysis. And then the other one that I haven't talked briefly about here in this building block slide is to recognize that our deterioration rates and the fact that our assets are deteriorating over time and all of the projects that we are developing and completing are helping to offset deterioration. So this is the big picture of performance gap analysis and what we need to do that. Okay, so drilling into this a little bit more. So, and Mike kind of set the stage for this at the very beginning. So what do we already know? So from prior workshops, we really focused heavily in our fundamentals workshop on the inventory and condition of our NHS, specific to pavement and bridges. That second bullet there We spent so much time, again, starting with our financial planning workshop, Caltrans doing an analysis based on state controller office data into getting the information out to our locals on a baseline investment by these 5 federal work types and doing an estimate based on the NHS. And so we gave the opportunity for this review and to see if these numbers made sense to our local partners. And these other 2 bullets about what we already know is, we asked, if we're trying to set a 10-year investment plan for the TAMP, should we be considering, based on these baseline numbers, an escalation rate or not? And the majority of our MPOs indicated that we do need to consider that over time. It does make sense. And then that last bullet there is we came to you again, our local MPO partners to ask, have you considered risk mitigation in these costs that we're providing to you by these 5 federal work types? And if so, let us know what they are. So we gave that opportunity to kind of set the stage for this and to be able to have agencies think about whether or not we are investing in risk mitigation work. And I can tell you based on the survey responses that, there were a number of MPOs that felt that for bridge assets that we were doing risk mitigation, it was included in these investments. For pavement, I would say the majority indicated that it was not included. And in some cases, some agencies that were, honest about it, they just didn't know. So I think moving forward, we need to think about this more as we actually put this together for the TAMP. So what do we still need, and what can we assume as we move forward and do a performance gap analysis for the TAMP? And I list these 3 here. Mainly, I want to focus on the deterioration rates and unit costs of the work, primarily because we don't have a lot of data on deterioration rates. I can tell you that I did have an analysis done on the current, information we had available through our pavement data, our good, fair, poor over time. And we just didn't have, from a statewide perspective, and even drilling down into the local NHS, enough information to be able to provide this by region or to give a better perspective, other than I think from a reasonable starting place, we could assume that our local NHS routes are similar to our class 3 pavements on the state highway system. So I just wanted to bring up these deterioration rates that are going to be included in our tool as a starting point, because it's important to understand where we're getting these numbers from. The same can be said for bridge. We do have more historical basis to provide information on the local NHS, but at a starting point, we think that it's similar enough and reasonable to assume a similar rate to the state highway bridge deterioration rates that we've used in our analysis for state-owned assets. With regards to the unit costs of work, I can again let you know that I received the draft 2020 local streets and roads needs assessment. I believe that report's going to be finalized next month, but I wanted to take a look at it from a unit cost perspective to see if we could come up with, better unit costs for the local NHS. And based on the information in that report, I can tell you the unit costs are really high. In fact, they're about 18 to 24% higher than the prior report, which is only a couple years old, I believe. The reason for that, we think, is because, again, it's including all ancillary type work, all within a unit cost specific for pavement and bridges. So it's based on this total project cost that, includes potentially landscape work and other types of work, drainage work. When we have done this work already for the state highway system, we've been able to isolate a better unit cost for both pavement and bridges. And so for a starting point, again, I think we can go ahead and start with our state highway system unit costs for this analysis, and you will have the opportunity to refine that moving forward. Now, with regards to targets, I don't think I need to say too much more. I think Mike and Brad have already talked about the performance gap and how you can compare your desired state to these expected outcomes based on the performance gap analysis. Now, the other point I wanted to make before I turn it over to you, Weizhou, in our office is to really talk about how we're mapping the work types to condition improvement. So I think towards the end of Brad's presentation, he talked about this, and he showed a table, and it showed the different investments in each of the work types. And for those of you who attended our prior workshop on financial planning, you did see our work types defined in this way. And we have the 5 labeled here as initial construction, maintenance, preservation, rehab, and reconstruction. And what we need to do is figure out in our model which of these investments are helping us to improve asset condition. So the assumptions made going into this is that, you know, our initial construction is really adding new inventory over the TAMP 10-year period. So yes, those investments are there, and we're spending a significant amount of money on doing this work. But as far as the model itself and the methodology, we're not considering that in improving our asset condition. And as far as the maintenance work, a similar assumption is made in that type of work is actually helping us to maintain the asset condition over time. So what does that leave us? It leaves us preservation, rehabilitation, and reconstruction type work over the 10-year period. And, you know, we're looking at these specific categories in the analysis to see what our end result would be. So we're looking at our fair asset conditions going to good condition over a 10-year period. And these investments that you have weighed in on and provided back to Caltrans is really, you know, when we think about those investments, you can think about preservation and rehabilitation being contributing to the improvement from fair to good. And then when you look at the poor assets and being able to improve them, it's going to be a portion of your preservation and rehabilitation investments and pretty much 100%, right, of your reconstruction investments. So with that, I'm hoping I give enough of an overview on our performance gap analysis and what goes into it. And then I'm going to go ahead now and turn this over to Yue Zhou from the Office of Asset Management. He has developed the 2022 California TAMP Asset Performance Simulation Tool. And he can go through this briefly to give a pretty much a high-level overview for the workshop. Yue, are you ready to go?
Yes, thank you, Dawn. So Mary Alice, can you give me the right to share? Oh, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yue Zhou. I'm a senior transportation engineer in Caltrans TAMP office. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to demonstrate this tool Dawn mentioned. And the tool, as Michael mentioned earlier, is developed as a sandbox for our local agency, so they can use their agency-specific information, such as this funding, unit cost, deterioration rates, this kind of specific information to predict the future asset condition. So then help them to develop some realistic short-term or long-term performance targets. So, so in the next 1 week or so, we are going to send each agency a copy of this tool. And we also have scheduled a meeting in August to discuss this tool in more details. So in this workshop, I'm going to just give a very brief overview of this tool. So this tool is developed as an Excel spreadsheet. So it includes both the instruction and also this calculation or tool types. So for the instruction just explains this tool payment or bridge in details. So it's now on the development. And then I know that for most of agencies, they have both payment and bridges. So they have two analysis tab when we send the tool. But for some of them, they may only have payment asset in their NHS. So and for the tool itself, it's organized into 4 parts. So the main parts are B, analysis parameters, and C, which is analysis results. So the B, so in B, so only these kind of green highlighted cells are allow the users to edit. All other input are preset or calculated. So you can see for some parameters like investment, like unit cost and development, and the iteration rates. So the user has the freedom to choose to use either the default parameters that Dawn mentioned, or you can use the override parameters. So if you think you have better and agency-specific information. So I'm not going to go to the details, but I should emphasize one point here. We already talking about risk mitigation in our earlier discussions. So we provided this opportunity here for the agency to provide their dollars they could spend specifically for risk mitigation. So this is just the section B, which is analysis parameter section. Then move down to the section C. So this section C basically just calculate. Give a minute. Let's move it down. Shows the 4. Okay. So the analysis results part just calculate the projected condition at 10-year end and 4-year end based on the assumption in section B here. So the results are highlighted in these cells with bold and enlarged fonts. So in addition to this projected condition, we also estimate the performance gap here between this 10-year end projected condition and assumed performance target. And also we calculate the cost associated with this gap in this 10-year needs assessment. So the district, so the local agency will be able to use this information. Maybe they adjust the parameters in section B, so they can estimate the projected condition at the 10-year end. So they help them to make the decision about some agency-specific and realistic target for 10-year or for 4-year. So that's the analysis part C. So section D is just just if you have additional loads about the assumption you made in section B or anything else, or we have some kind of a block here, for you to put some kind of internal quality control here. So that's pretty much what I want to say now. So Michael and Dawn, do you have anything to add?
No, Yue, thank you very much. And I mean, for those that are watching, we kind of talked back and forth, and we really didn't feel that the workshop itself was the right forum to get into the technical details of how this operates. But as Yue mentioned, we are going to do a technical session on this worksheet, but we want to get it in everybody's hands, well, in the hands of the MPOs, so that you can look at it and get a little bit of time to formulate some questions, and then we'll do a technical session. We'll do kind of a deep dive and go through, sort of section by section what you need to do. But in general, what we've tried to do for you here is take these building blocks that Don was talking about and put them into an analysis framework. So this worksheet will come with your MPO's inventory and your MPO's condition, the finances that you provided us based on the 5 work types, and the additional information that's needed beyond what we already have is, an indication of how much of your budget or your finances you intend to spend on risk mitigation. So we're not getting into the specifics of what we have to do there, but we're gonna allow you to tell us, hey, a certain percentage of our budget is going to go to risk mitigation. And then in narrative, you can describe what that is. I mean, it's just we're going to end up with about 23 different investment strategies that we're then going to have to try to aggregate as a whole. So Don, you have the summary slide. Are you going to do this?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think you pretty much covered it, Mike. We just wanted to make sure that everyone understood, what this tool was all about, how it's available for any of our local partners to look at the, default values that Caltrans has come up with and look at the end results from the tool. If it's not reasonable, you have the ability to override the information based on the green fields that UA presented. And, I think it's a great opportunity to be able to simulate the impacts to performance outcomes over time. So that's really all I wanted to make sure that we communicated from this, the tool itself. That, Mike, I'm turning it back over to you.
All right, next slide then, please.
Oh, actually, sorry about that, Mike. Do you want me to go over that we're going to send this information out? This is just indicating that we will be sending the tool out to each of the MPOs. We are keeping this at a regional MPO level, but we encourage you to work with your local agencies in evaluating this 10-year end of period performance for pavement and bridges on the national highway system. And we do want this back by Friday, September 3rd. It's the weekend of Labor Day, I believe. So, you will be seeing this shortly from us. Once we get it all finalized, we'll send it out to you. And just keep in mind, we have about 6 weeks to get this done. And we think that the 6 weeks is adequate, but we really encourage you to start looking at it now because it will take some time to complete this work. And that's it.
Okay, so it's been a flurry of information. Okay, so let me try to get the big bullet points here. So first off, we're taking a very different approach for the 2022 TAMP in that we've developed this tool. We'll be, sending you the tool. We'll be providing some technical support on the use of the tool, with the goal being that each MPO will be able to do an agency-specific analysis, and that analysis will be, specific to your inventory, your condition, your finances, your risk tolerance, your unit costs, your deterioration rates. In other words, we really want you to take this worksheet and use it as a sandbox so that you can understand the relationships between these things. And what the worksheet gives you at the end of all of this is what we believe are reasonable 10 and 4-year targets for you based on the finances that you are planning to spend and your inventory size and condition and other factors. It will also do a calculation of how many dollars you actually need to achieve your target. So, you know, it occurred to us that in the initial TAMP, there were targets set that may not have even been achievable. And, you know, so we're hoping that this tool allows you to play around with that a bit. You know, you can't really break it. If you do, we'll send you another copy. You know, that's not broken. But, you know, it does bring all these pieces together. And I want to go back to the, you know, to the point that Brad was making with his balancing rocks. I mean, you are balancing the rocks for your agency. And, you know, and each agency is going to potentially put those rocks in different order. And the balance may look a little different in, you know, the northern part of the state from the southern part of the state. And what Caltrans values may be a little bit different than what the MPO values. And so, you know, rather than try to come up with one investment strategy, you know, at the end of the day, the TAMP has one investment strategy, but ours is going to be the aggregate of some 20 plus strategies brought together. And we feel like that is actually a true reflection of, you know, what California transportation agencies will be doing. Next slide. So action items, you're going to get the MPOs and certain RTPs that are acting as MPOs will get this performance tool. There is we are expecting a response back by September 3rd. We are going to be hosting a workshop on that spreadsheet only. All right, so we're not going to get back into all the background, but if, you know, there's technical questions, we'll sort of walk through the worksheet section by section and make sure everyone is putting the appropriate things in there. That will be, you know, very small because it's going to be 19 MPOs and a couple RTPAs. So it's going to be a smaller group. You'll be able to ask questions, you know, and we'll try to walk you through and make sure that everybody comes out of that August 16th meeting with, you know, with a good idea of how to use this tool, and hopefully, you know, you're done by the time we finish that meeting. Next slide. So this really concludes our investment strategy workshop. Our next workshop, which is on the improvement. So the TAMP generally is laid out into some, you know, general categories. We have, you know, where we are today in terms of inventory condition, budget. Then we have, you know, where we want to be, our targets. We have some analysis of what it would take to get to our targets. You know, maybe that's more money. Maybe that's a change of investment. You know, maybe it's doing something differently with risk. Maybe it's doing something differently with life cycle planning. But the improvement plan workshop is really where we get back together and say, okay, you know, what are the things that we have identified through the series of all these workshops that we want to put in our TAMP. And, you know, just to kind of give you a teaser for that, in our last TAMP, one of the things that was identified was the need to better share data. And so then going into this TAMP, we developed the, you know, the shape files for the NHS and the downloadable Google Earth files or PDF files, so that, you know, that data sharing on inventory and condition was, you know, 100%. And I think I was really, you know, reassured when we did the survey before that workshop of who knew where their NHS was and what condition the assets were, it was in the low teens. And then at the end of that workshop, we had over 90% of folks said, yes, we're confident that we, can get our inventory, we know where the NHS is and we know what condition it's in. If we don't know those basic things, then, we're sort of lost before we started. But that enhancement, if you will, was identified an improvement in our prior TAMP. And so, it's one of those things, okay, we could put a checkbox by it, we did it, but it wasn't just that we accomplished the improvement, it was that we feel like the 2022 TAMP will be better for it. So, so you kind of think between now and, this next workshop, and it'll probably be, we're still trying to nail down a date, but most likely it'll be in the latter half of August. There's certain things we want to make sure we avoid, like the commission meetings and so forth. And if need be, we might push it into the early part of September. But that will really kind of complete all of the, the materials and things that we need to actually draft the first draft of the TAMP. And then, once the first draft of the TAMP is done, it'll be distributed for comments, and we can just address the comments as they come in. Again, and, sort of the finish line for us right now is a March delivery of the California TAMP to the Federal Highway Administration, to the Transportation Commission in California, and then let them, get into it and start, looking at things from their perspective. So that's what's kind of coming up in the not too distant future. Next slide. So I want to do some thank yous. First and foremost, I want to thank the Federal Highway Administration. I didn't mention it early on, but the Federal Highway Administration made the funding available for us to have Brad come and present. And I certainly want to, thank Brad and Applied Pavement Technology for them bringing their expertise into this workshop. But that would not have been possible without the Federal Highway Administration funding that work. So appreciate that. Dawn, thank you very much for, getting all of these parts organized, and UA for all your work in the worksheet. And there's a whole slew of other of our staff that have been working behind the scenes with data and other things. And we thank them before this workshop. They know who they are. And certainly Mary Alice, who's the glue that sort of makes all the WebEx and everything happen. Thank you. And for everybody that's attended, thank you for, for attending today. And we'll just, this will kind of end our formal session. We'll go right into the informal session. If anybody has questions that they want to ask and didn't do it during the workshop, feel free to just hang on the WebEx for a couple minutes, and we'll give everyone an opportunity to exit out, and then we'll get into those questions on a more informal basis. So with that, we're formally adjourned, and just thank you everybody for your continued participation in these workshops. It's really important.